We're going after the sour crude. We're going offshore, very deep water, oil, and we're bringing tar sands online from Alberta and that sort of thing. So the energy profit ratio is starting to fall pretty fast. You can see oil sands production about 3, corn ethanol. It's debatable, but it's maybe break even. And then just for comparison, hydrogen from water, because hydrogen, water is covalently bound. It takes a lot of energy to put in. People say we'll have a hydrogen economy. Well, splitting water is energy intensive process. So keep that in mind. This is not a new phenomenon. This is part of, I think, the tragedy of the situation. Tragedy in the classic Greek sense that we were forewarned of this. We should have known that we would reach a point of peak oil, and it was first described in terms of a mathematical presentation at a Shell Oil conference back in the 1950s by this gentleman, M. King Hubbert, who was a brilliant geophysicist of his day, and in fact he was at the pinnacle of his career when he described the phenomenon of peak oil. In this case, he was talking about the lower 48 states. Now, we were the Saudi Arabia in the 1950s. Gasoline, was cheap, right? It was 20 cents a gallon or 25 cents a gallon. Nobody believed that there would ever be an end to it. So Hubbert comes along and says, I have an analysis that is based upon field-by-field depletion, and it looks like by 1970, he reckoned, that we would reach a midpoint of production, and then it would fall from there. His superiors in the company said, don't you dare talk about this. Please don't present this. It'll ruin your career, and this is not good. And yet he did, and he got a lot of scorn for it. In fact, a lot of people, he dropped in terms of his recognition until much later when he was proven right. Taking up the mantle is nowadays a gentleman named Colin Campbell, and he worked for Total Fina and some other oil companies. He's now retired, and for the past 15 or so years, he's been warning about peak oil. And there he is in a pub in Ballydehob, Ireland, describing peak beer. And he uses when the glass is half empty, you begin worrying. He's also the founder of ASPO, which is the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, which is a group of mostly retired petroleum geologists, energy analysts, and even some economists. So here's what Hubbert was up against back in the 1950s. We were on the upslope of production. East Texas was being exploited. There was no end in sight. Practically sink a straw in the ground, and oil comes up. And we were in the boom times, producing doubling production every 15 years. How could Hubbert possibly say something so crazy as this would ever end? Party would never end. Here it is. Here's the end. At least the peak of production, 1970, he was right on. And funny enough, he wasn't, he never got, I don't think he ever got calls of, reconciliation from people who scorned him in the past. And, but it wasn't really discovered until much later that we had reached peak. Because in 1970, what we decided to do was just drill a lot more. We just drilled thinking, well, we'll just regain our status again. This can't be ending. So it was a drill baby drill call in the 1970s, and it coincided, of course, with the oil embargo. So there are all sorts of reasons to look for oil, go offshore. Alaska came online. It had been discovered in the late 60s, and it came in line. This is the lower 48, but you can, if I were to add, it would be a shoulder. I think there's a later graph that shows a shoulder, but we never regained that peak production that we had in 1970. The other thing I want to mention is the peak-to-peak discovery versus production. It's a very simple concept, but it gives you a clue that we might be indeed at peak oil today globally. We peaked in discovery in the 1930s. That's when we discovered the largest fields. And then year on year, we discovered less and less until finally we're discovering tiny little pockets of oil and going after them in very dangerous conditions, as you saw in the Gulf of Mexico. So in this case, peak-to-peak discovery versus production in 40 years. Here is the profile now for the world. This is the 54 of the 65 most important oil-producing countries, and they are now past peak. So they've essentially encountered what we did back in the 1970s. We only have about 11 countries now that are producing more oil year on year. They have to make up now for the other countries that are depleting year on year. That's one clue that if we're not at peak, we're very close to it. These are production wedges over time. Okay, so each colored layer is the contribution of the respective country, and then the year of peaking follows the name of the country. So ASPO, the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, Colin Campbell's group, has put together a field-by-field analysis of the entire world, all of the major regions, the US 48, Europe, Russia, combined other places in the world, the Middle East, mostly OPEC, and then some other rare types of liquid fuels like natural gas liquids, deep water is in the dark blue. That might go faster because there might be more regulation on deep water after the Macondo disaster. And then heavy stuff in the black, which is the oil shales and the heavy crude from Orinoco and Venezuela and the tar sands of Alberta, which are environmentally devastating, by the way. It takes tremendous water in order to steam the oil off the sands, essentially. So they think that peak occurs around 2010. And I think there's kind of a consensus that it's generally about now, and we're on a plateau. By the way, I did forget to mention that as we did go into depletion, we did go on the downslope production. Our appetite didn't stop. We found another source, which was the Middle East. So if Americans want to know why they're so dependent upon foreign oil, well, peak oil had a lot to explain about why we are. So the corollary is more and more imports year on year to satisfy our demand. This is a very important slide because what it demonstrates is really the differential between discovery and production. Discovery is in the histograms, so the red histograms are all historic discovery. The green are likely future discoveries. So that is the discovery profile. The peak of discovery is about 1960. The blue line is our use of oil, is our production year on year, and it's been going up. And extrapolating that line into the future is what the International Energy Agency believes we will derive in terms of production year on year. Notice the differential. We're using about 4 barrels of oil for every one we produce now. How long can that go on? Are we likely, after the world has been fully searched for oil, to be discovering what we did in 1960? It doesn't seem possible. Here's the plateau that I was describing a moment ago. And for peak oil observers, we were noting in 2005 that as much as demand was increasing throughout the world, especially from China and India, we weren't getting any more production. And there were many calls to increase production, and there were a lot of calls that the oil companies are, they're hiding production, they're not producing enough, OPEC's not producing enough just to drive up prices. Yes, that might be true. I mean, OPEC likes a high price, but they don't want a price so high that it destroys demand by risking the economy going into a global recession. So they would never do such a thing. And I think that's an indication that they're at peak as well, that they cannot produce anymore. We don't know because it's proprietary information and they're not sharing it. So we've been at that peak for about 5 years now, and it coincided in 2008 as demand became fierce with that price spike that I think everybody here remembers, when oil reached about $140 a barrel. And that triggered the recession. That was really key because we were spending more and more on oil and less on other things. And that's what finally burst the bubble. Yes, the bubble was composed of a lot of funny money, a lot of speculation, a lot of securitization, a lot of this, but ultimately it was oil prices that burst it. And then demand dropped because, as our speaker earlier said, and we've been producing less CO2 because we've been in a recession. And industry crashed, jobs were lost, and so we're using less oil year on year, and the demand has now fallen below the production ceiling. So we have this kind of area where we're not really aware of it. Obviously, I believe. Most people believed once the oil price dropped, their attention was, okay, we have an economic disaster now. We've got to pay attention to that. They're not thinking about oil anymore. But really, that's the fundamental. Lying out there is the ceiling of production, what's possible to produce. And we're just below that production ceiling now. So the price fell. This is a key to what's to come, because if we are at peak oil and we have reached that peak at plateau, once the economy, it stands to reason, once the economy recovers, we begin employing people, we begin making things again, shipping things again, using more oil, moving stuff around, we're going to hit the ceiling again, and the price will spike, and then it'll collapse again as the economy collapses. And this is what is known as an undulating plateau of oil production and a really systemic economic crisis. And then, you know, we think that's bad, but of course what we're anticipating is again a worldwide beginning of a decline. The ceiling begins to lower. So this is what we have to anticipate and prepare for. So price shocks as production capacity limits are breached. And then you have this off and on recession and spikes in price. So besides economic risks of the high price and volatility in price, what other vulnerabilities are apparent if we're going to talk about communities adapting to peak oil? Let's begin with transportation because it's the most obvious one. Oil demand by sector, the lion's share is transportation, which uses about 68%. The second largest piece of the pie is industry, uses about 23%, and then it's broken down. Electricity generation, residential home heating in the East Coast, in the Northeast, they use a lot of home heating fuel, and so forth. But transportation we need to focus on predominantly because that is the single most popular mode of getting people around, whether it's to to work or to get basic needs and so forth. As I said before, unfortunately, we've designed a built environment and a transportation system that operates optimally on oil. This is a major vulnerability. I put a map of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Northeast sector of the United States as an example. And the darkened, the shaded area that extends from, you can see from Milwaukee to Chicago, around Lake Michigan, South Bend, Kalamazoo, all the way, Detroit, etc., all the way out to Boston, is essentially a gigantic suburban development. You can go on the interstates and travel and almost never leave the suburbs because people have been moving further and further and further out from their jobs in central cities. Why? Because they had the ability to do so. Why not? I mean, oil's cheap. I can live out 30 miles and commute 30 miles a day to my job. It's not a problem. It's not a problem until we reach the point where oil becomes scarce. The other vulnerability is that food travels on average 1,400 miles from origin to consumer. Industrial agriculture means that optimally you grow food over here, say California. It's good to grow at this season, and you can transport it by air, by trailer truck, etc., to anywhere in the country. So that is an enormous vulnerability that we have to reckon with. And again, we've had this decanting of the population out of the largest cities, where now we have the phenomenon of 40% are urban dwellers, 60% of these cities are suburbanites. Gigantic sprawl outside cities. That's a new phenomenon that's happened essentially post-World War II. This kind of development, housing development, is by definition an oil-intensive living arrangement. I ask students, imagine living in a place like this without a car. So, but this is reproduced all around the country.